expecting to get the kind of closure that was offered. This was a Jewish Zoom funeral. It was incredibly well done, and very, very nice. So I'll get right into it then. This stream is about this is a stream about my perspective as a legitimate Jewish communist and Nato-Nazism, Jewish communism, and the continuity of Holocaust. Those are a lot of words, right? A lot of words, but they're important words because if you look at Europe in the 1940s, 1930s, 1920s, etc., it's very clear that there were a lot of Jewish socialists, communists, a lot of Jewish anarchists, a lot of Jewish people on the left. There are a lot of Jewish Soviets too. Put all these labels aside, it's safe to say that there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jewish collectivist thinking individuals. It is or was at one point a core tenet in Jewish history, culture, and ideology. That's a fact. Now, that's not the case anymore. There are a lot of reasons for that, reasons that need to be discussed, because frankly, those who would have discussed them in the past are not alive because they were exterminated in the Holocaust, right? There's one thing Hitler hated more than a Jew, and it was a Jewish communist, right? And that goes for every Nazi because we're a threat. So, I was talking to my friend or my comrade, Esha, a lot, and she was showing all these pictures of Jews who fought in the resistance or fought for the Soviets, Jews who liberated concentration camps, or rather Jews who lived in concentration camps, Jews who were exterminated in areas like Hungary after the Second World War. Now, going back to before the end of the Second World War, we all know, or anyone who knows anything about history, knows that it was actually the Soviets who defeated Hitler, primarily. Yes, we had a bomb. We had a big bomb, but we didn't use it in Germany. We didn't use it in Europe. That being said, 26 million Soviets, 26 million Soviets died trying to liberate the rest of my people. So when I see people criticizing the Soviet Union or the Holocaust, criticizing the Soviet Union or even Joseph Stalin, I often wonder if these people are actually just expressing some latent anti-Semitism. I don't know. There's a lot of reasons people don't realize these kinds of things, as I said earlier, and we're going to start in 1994, right? Before the Holocaust was well and truly ended. The Holocaust, not Holocaust, right? Holocaust is a word independent from the Holocaust. So in 1944, the gold standard was established. And the gold standard led to a lot of imperialist tensions in the world because it created a clear line between those who had and those who didn't in terms of countries. So the gold standard was enacted in 1944, and this was largely done, in my belief, to begin ensuring that the Soviet Union fell and that the United States could pick up the pieces in Europe and use it to maintain or use it to assert its global dominance through finances. Now, in 1944, after the gold standard was created, the war had still not won. The war ended in 1945. But when Hitler took that cyanide pill and killed himself and his dog, because as the Red Army was marching on his bunker, or advancing on his bunker, they weren't marching; they were fucking killing Nazis. They were killing Nazis. Um, all the fascists, all the right wing nationalists in Europe who had sided with the Nazis and exterminated Jews, right? Just because they weren't wearing a German uniform doesn't mean they weren't hanging children from meat hooks in Hungary, right? They were doing those things. The Hungarian nationalists were doing these things. And it's not just the Hungarian nationalists by any means. But these fascists didn't just disappear, right, when Hitler killed himself. A lot of people talk about like, oh, Hitler's still alive. Do we really know? We've never seen the body. Okay, let me tell you something. All right. If I, for argument's sake, was Hitler, right? Obviously, I'm not Hitler. But if I was Hitler, the Red Army was about to capture me, I'd fucking kill myself too. I mean, they would have tortured him for the rest of his life. It would have been bad. Well, no, it would have been great, but it's completely legitimate to believe that Hitler killed himself and that Hitler had an escape plan, i.e. death, before the Nazis or before the Soviets got to him. Now, why is this all important? Nato-Nazism. Now, this is a term I've started using very recently, Nato-Nazism, because I think it perfectly encapsulates the historical nature of not only what is going on in the world today, but how it started. How imperialism got to the point where it's at today, right? And you can look at things like Operation Paperclip, right? Operation Paperclip is an extremely well-documented public information operation led by Allied forces to move basically escaped German Nazis. So I'm going to Google Operation Paperclip for everyone, and I'm going to read something brief from it. It's a Wikipedia page, right? Operation Paperclip was a secret program of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, largely carried out by special agents of Army CIC, in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, such as Werner von Braun and his V-2 rocket team, were taken from Germany to the United States for the U.S. government employment. Nazis, primarily between 1945 and 1959. Many were former members, and some were former leaders of the Nazi Party, right? That is the first paragraph of the Wikipedia entry. Now, I'm not saying Wikipedia is this end-all and be-all source, but anyone who knows anything about Wikipedia knows that it's basically controlled by Google and high-tech companies in the pockets of empire who get these like billion-dollar contracts from the CIA and things of that nature, right? So this can be understood as predominantly or mostly reliable. Operation Paperclip. They also had things called rat lines, and rat lines were, and you can Google this as well, very well documented. Rat lines were basically a way for the United States and Allied forces to smuggle Nazis out of Europe and into South America. That's very important because this enabled the United States and NATO forces, NATO allied, whatever forces, to begin sort of exporting the Holocaust. Exporting the Holocaust is exactly what things like Operation Paperclip and rat lines accomplished. And we see that today in South America, where because of this sort of imported fascism, this imported Holocaust, there has been mass genocide in South America, right? So in that sense, the Holocaust is still continuing because these fascists were exported, these Nazis, these literal Nazis, were exported into South America. to fight back against socialists and communists, right? So this was very intentional on behalf of the United States. This was them trying to expand their global hegemony. And you see the same thing in Israel, okay? In Israel. Israel, to me, as a Jewish communist, somebody who is speaking for my dead ancestors because they can't speak for themselves, Israel is a rogue tribe, right? And I say that in the historical sense, the cultural sense, and in the religious sense, okay? The Jewish God does not approve of Israel, of the occupation of Jerusalem. That's just nonsense. So, continuing, Palestine, right? Jews prior to the Holocaust in Europe, Ashkenazi Jews like myself and other ethnic groups of Jews, were derogatorily referred to as Palestinian in prior to the Holocaust in Europe. Like, y'all don't belong here. That's just a Palestinian, right? Even Immanuel Kant referred to Jews as Palestinians at one point. And I'm not saying this to say that Jews are Palestinians or indigenous. They are not. Jews are nomadic people. But what I am saying is that the Jews belonged in Europe. My people belonged in Europe. And they've left, or some of them have left. The people who left, who sought land that wasn't theirs for religious purposes, for extremist purposes, they're a rogue tribe. They don't represent the rest of us. And if you talk to an American Jew, most of them, almost all of them, at least all the Jews that I've experienced, I'd like to say, don't approve of what Israel is doing, right? I mean, they might not express it because they're afraid, right? That's a real thing. I'm not justifying that fear or that, I would call it cowardice. But they're afraid, right? Because Israel is a very, very powerful tribe, where Israeli Jews currently, occupied Israeli Jews currently are a very powerful tribe that have a great deal of resources and are essential for Western dominance, right? So these people fled Europe. Instead of rebuilding their communities and instead of rebuilding their culture, and lifting each other up, they fled. They ran away after they were released from the Holocaust. They said, we have nothing else here. We're leaving. That is also an act of cowardice. And to me, the antithesis of being a Jew. So, obviously I don't support Israel. Obviously, I think Israel is now taking the, I have someone once said that, someone I trust and who's very intelligent once said that Israel is a spiritual continuation of the Holocaust. And I think that's true, but I'm hoping to take this a step farther and explain how Israel is more than just a spiritual continuation of the Holocaust. It is actually a material and historical continuation of the Holocaust. I believe it was Derriere Sin. Derriere Sin, the Derriere Sin, I truly apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. The Derriere Sin Massacre took place on April 9th, 1948. When around 130 fighters of the far right-wing Zionist paramilitary groups Irgun and Lehi killed about 107 Palestinian Arabs, including women and children. Now, why did they feel justified in doing that? Because of the Holocaust. And that's not a justification in my mind. That's a cop-out. That's an excuse. That's religious fanaticism. And that's, this is the excuse they still use to this day. When you talk to a Zionist, right, one of these members of this rogue Zionist tribe, And you talk to them and you talk to them. Eventually, it all boils down to we can't allow the Holocaust to happen again. Well, turns out they are the Holocaust. They've become the Holocaust. They've become a Holocaust. They've continued it, right? The slaughter of Palestinians started by right-wing Zionists, fascist Zionists, who established an ethno-state and occupied somebody else's land. The slaughter of these people has not stopped since World War II ended, right? And it's picked up basically around the end of World War II. So when people try to say, oh, this or that about Jews protecting themselves, it's fucking bullshit. It's all lies. It's lies. It's imperialist lies justifying genocide, right? Justifying apartheid, justifying genocide, justifying Jewish supremacy over indigenous people. It's fucked. It's fucked. It's the antithesis of being a Jew, which is why I call these people a rogue tribe, and why I'm referring to them as a cutout of this sort of Nato-Nazi faction that has gained prominence over the world through use of things like the gold standard and clandestine operations like Operation Paperclip and the rat lines, which I referenced earlier in the live stream if you were listening. Now, Albert Einstein has this fantastic quote. And let's see if I can find it, because I've been tweeting and posting a lot about this stuff. So let me go back into I've been trying to do this while I've been talking kind of a little bit. And while I look for this letter that Einstein and company, like Hannah Arendt, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I will pronounce or missay things occasionally because I'm dyslexic. But let's see. But where was I going with this? Okay, yeah. So Einstein on Israeli fascism to the New York Times submitted a letter. Einstein and many other prominent Jewish figures submitted a letter to the New York Times. And this is a direct quote. The Derriere Sin incident exemplifies, it wasn't an incident, it was it's ethnic cleansing, right? The Derriere Sin incident exemplifies the character and actions of the Freedom Party. With the Jewish community, they have preached an admixture of ultranationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority. Like other fascist parties, they have been used to break strikes, have themselves pressed for the destruction of free trade unions. In their stead, they have proposed corporate unions on the Italian fascist model. And that comes from Albert fucking Einstein. Albert Einstein, the smartest man to have ever lived, supposedly, Jewish, socialist, and even dyslexic. So not that that's actually pertinent. I just find that to be an interesting fact because of my personal circumstances. So clearly Einstein was very much against Israel. Einstein also turned down the opportunity to be the president of Israel, to be the second president of Israel. Now, there are a lot of people talk about this, talk about that. But at the end of the day, Einstein did not support Israel because Israel is the antithesis of Jewish culture and identity. And it's only because of these Western imperialist capitalist powers that people seem to have forgotten that, which is disgusting to me. So when I, talk about this kind of things, I'm talking about them because I need to give voice to my ancestors, right? My ancestors who are no longer here. Because most of them, again, were wiped out in the Holocaust. And if they survived the Holocaust, most of them, most of the remaining ones were killed during fascist uprisings throughout Europe after the Holocaust ended. Because again, all these right-wing nationalist fascists didn't just disappear, right? They led uprisings against Jews, which the Soviet Union had propped up to seek out their own justice, right? Now, anyone who comes to me and says, like, the Soviet Union didn't prop up Jews, like, get fucking real. Do you have any idea what communism actually is? I doubt it. If you're saying those kinds of things. Obviously, the Soviets propped up the Jews after they liberated them, right? Because that's how communism works, right? Okay, so Yeah. So, the fall of the Soviet Union was like the second sort of apocalyptic event for Jewish communists, um, aside from the Holocaust, where again, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jewish socialists, communists, and anarchists were exterminated. Now, I want to present you with an idea. It's a disturbing one. Consider the economics of a death camp. Now, I've said this before. Consider the economics of a death camp. And now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean like trade, right? I don't mean like the financial system inside a death camp. Exactly. I mean, it's a part of that. But what I also mean is think of how the Jews, how the people, because it wasn't just Jews, as we all know, how the people inside death camps survived. How did those who did survive, how did they manage to survive for as long as they did? How did they rely on each other to survive? And what sort of internal structures did they use? Now, it becomes obvious that this situation that they were in would have demanded a form of collectivism, right? Who gets the moldy bread, right? Who goes first in line to the gas chamber? All these decisions are horrible, horrible decisions that had to be made. But they were made from a sense of collectivism. So if anyone wants to come and tell me that, the Jews in the camps weren't socialists of some sort, I mean, I don't think you really understand the reality of a death camp, if you're going to make that claim. Now, I do. Not that I've been to one, but I've seen photos. I've seen a lot of photos. I've seen things that shook me to my core. And it becomes quite evident that there is a form of collectivism absolutely necessary to exist in that environment. Not up for debate. So it's not only just, Africa, or that part of Africa and the Middle East and South America that NATO and ally forces exported sort of fascism or like literal Nazis and the Holocaust and imperialism too, because American hegemony as we know it today largely started a year before the Holocaust ended, and I pointed that out with the gold standard. So it's also Asia, right? And Vietnam, right, where they propped up capitalists, nationalists, to continue more mass death. I mean, this is all a direct result from the Holocaust. And again, it's not just Africa, it's not just Asia, it's not just Europe where these things started happening. It's literally every continent. And if you know a little bit about the history of U.S. imperialism, that becomes quite evident. So that's why this stream's labeled, Nato-Nazism and the continuity of Holocaust, because they've literally continued the Holocaust. They've just given it a new form, right? They've made it woke. And I think that's, something that needs to be reckoned with. Because if we don't reckon with it, if I'm not able to identify Stalin as the guy who liberated what was left of my people, then you have room for all these people to revise history. You have NATO, you give NATO and like these oligarchs that are still oppressing us the authority to rewrite history. And that's, that history would not be able to be rewritten as it is being today if those hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jewish socialists were still alive. We'd be living in an incredibly different world right now, all over, if those people were still alive. That's deeply unsettling to me. And I think that every Jewish person needs to consider this. If they're not willing to consider this, then I mean, aren't they turning their back on their ancestors? I can't comprehend an argument against that. Um, you can go to my pages, and I've been linking all these photos of armed Jewish communists, armed Jewish socialists, armed partisans who relied on collectivism to even like exist. So, um, just because Joseph fucking Goebbels decided to say, oh, look at all those Jewish communists. They're so bad. They're in charge of everything. Just because Goebbels said that doesn't mean that there weren't hundreds of thousands of millions of Jewish communists and socialists. And to say that there weren't just hundreds of thousands, if not millions, is frankly anti-Semitic and ahistorical. It's offensive. And nobody is talking about this because, again, NATO has rewritten history. Allied forces have rewritten history. And so it's really, it's disappointing to me again when I see people criticizing the Soviet Union because they liberated the rest of my people. Stalin liberated the rest of my people, and these are not perfect utopias by any means, but that's the reality of the situation. So yeah, that's been about a half hour. We covered the gold standard, we covered U.S. imperialism, we covered Nato-Nazism and the exportation of Holocaust and the continuity of Holocaust. I think that's pretty good. Yeah, so I hopefully you'll anyone who is listening or listens to this later will hear it and share their thoughts with me. I love that. I'd love to continue the conversation. If you have any more information regarding this sort of phenomenon of Nato-Nazism and the erasure of Jewish socialism, I'd fucking love to see it. Even if it's just a picture of Jewish partisans, those make me incredibly happy to see, because Jews didn't just go out without a fight, and we never have, and we never will. And the rogue faction in Israel, the rogue tribe in Israel, in my opinion, needs to be, IDF members, right? They need to be sent to The Hague and tried like the war criminals that they are. And the citizens who are not in the IDF, now anyone who knows anything about Israel knows that they have conscription at the age of 18. There was a girl recently who was a conscientious objector and is, I believe, still in prison, whatever, today, because she refuses to slaughter innocent indigenous people, which is exactly what the Jewish ethno-state or the rogue tribe of colonial Jews is doing, right? They're slaughtering people and they're continuing the Holocaust on a historical, material, and cultural level. And spiritual level. Yep. Anyways, that's it. Power to the people.